But even if it wasn't a measured and thoughtful book, and as I say, I don't feel necessarily massively qualified to judge that. The idea that you should be able to publish a non-measured, a non-thoughtful, a polemical book about anything you want. Yeah. Otherwise, we have nothing. We're just a collection of kind of rules laid down by people who have no authority and no kind of mandate. It's just extraordinary that we're in this situation.
Yeah, I agree.
So in one sense, the book itself doesn't really matter. What matters is the fact that it should be free to read. If it's well written enough, which it was, if it's authoritative enough, which it was, and if it was argued well enough, which it was, qualitatively, it's good enough to be published.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name is Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor and your host. And in this bonus episode, myself and 3 writers talk about our summer reading recommendations. So sit back and enjoy as we suggest our picks of history and historical fiction. Do let me know your thoughts. Links to all the titles are in the show notes, as well as my email address and Twitter links. Until then, I'll hand you over to me talking summer reads with the gang. So today on the podcast we have a bit of a treat. This is a first timer in that we've got foursome on our podcast, and we're going to be talking summer reads. And so I have 3 very distinguished guests with me who also serve on the board of Aspects of History. And so I need to mind my P's and Q's here. So I have with me Roger Moorhouse, the historian, who's been on the show twice already, written wonderful books, most recently First to Fight, and he's got another book coming up in August, so we'll hear all about that. We have Antonia Senior, the historical fiction reviewer for The Times and the author of a few fiction books herself. And then finally we have Richard Foreman, who is a very prolific novelist and publisher, and he will, I'm sure, be forthright with his opinions. So we'll kick off with what we're doing today. We're talking summer reads. So I thought I'd kick off with one particular book. But dear listeners, I just want to let you know, I have to warn you that there are libations being passed around. We are drinking. And so if you hear the odd glass clink or the odd word being slurred, don't judge us too terribly. But it's the middle of the day, so this is not a common occurrence for us, so maybe we won't overdo it too much. Right, so we're going to start off with a book that I read very recently and interviewed the author, and he was absolutely just quite inspiring, actually, and that's Serhiy Plokhy, a Ukrainian historian. So I thought we'd kick off with that. And Roger, I know, is interested in that. But Roger, I read this book, and speaking to Serhiy, he was very inspirational because the book is almost a paean to the Ukrainian people, I thought, and I wanted to get your view on that, and then Richard and Antonia chip in.
Yeah, it is absolutely. He is the man for Ukrainian history, alongside, I would say, Timothy Snyder. So the two of them really have cornered the market for Ukrainian history. Not that there was particularly a market before a few years ago. But certainly, they're making hay now with the events of the last year with the Russian invasion, and his book, his History of Ukraine, Gates of Europe, I think it's called, which has been out for about 15 years, went straight to the bestseller lists upon the Russian invasion of last year. So there's something here for the an ill wind bringing some good to somebody, because it did well for him, promoted him back into the limelight. And it is a fantastic book. So he started writing it just on the invasion, February 22, and it covers essentially, I think, most of the events. I think he finished writing a year later, so in February 23. So there's really been rushed through, bearing in mind that publishers these days at least take 12 months in production, so this has been really rushed through, and necessarily so. But it is a brilliant book. I mean, it's relatively concise. I think Were I his editor, I think I would have cut it down a bit more. I mean, it's about 300 nods, probably 350 pages of text, which is pretty good for a big subject. It is one of those that frustratingly...
You'd have cut it further.
I would have done. I think certainly the sort of the prelude stuff, the run up, where he talks about Ukraine's tortured history with Russia in the 19th century and beyond, and then up to Ukrainian independence in 91, and then that relationship with Russia, all of which of course needs to be in there. But you do have, the book is about the Russian-Ukrainian war. It is one of those books where it takes until, a third of the way in, so 130 pages plus, before you actually get to February 22, which I always find slightly frustrating, because you want to sort of get to the nub of what you want to read about.
But didn't the war start in 2014?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, he's outlining that as well, but still, I think there was too much of that sort of prehistory was there. I mean, it needs to be there, of course, but I would have cut that down myself. Right. Were I his editor.
Right.
But still, I mean, he writes brilliantly. Again, for an academic, he writes really well. There's lovely clarity to it. There's no sort of jargonising and so on. It's not. You don't have to reread paragraphs, which you often do with academics, bless them. So that's absolutely brilliant in it, I think. Again, I'm sounding critical. It's a brilliant book, and I would absolutely recommend it. It would benefit from some little journalistic flourishes, left, right, and centre. That's one thing. It is a tad arid, we have to say, but it's still. I mean, it's brilliant. It is. I think it's the book on the Russian-Ukrainian war. I think the only thing that comes close, which I would also recommend. I know we're talking about books for this year, but Owen Matthews' book for last year, which came out, called Overreach, which I thought was fantastic. And that does have that sort of journalistic flair to it that just makes it a bit more of a page turner as well. So that I would recommend as well, which is probably coming out in paperback sometime soon.
Yeah.
So that I would recommend as well.
Well, you used to have that journalism was the first draft of history, but now, in a sense, history books are coming out on a war that there doesn't seem to be necessarily an end to, which is slightly different in terms of what publishing is used to. Although, I in a sense, the framing of the war is that the Ukrainians are on the side of the angels, and let's face it, the Soviet Empire, let's call it, is on the side of the devils, which for
Russian Empire.
Well, let's call it a Soviet Empire, and it's rare that happens where there is this sort of clear-cut good and bad guys in a war.
Yeah.
I know there will be people out there that will slightly disagree and say there's more nuance, but for argument's sake, we are dealing with a sort of unjust war.
Yeah, he does make that point. He says this is a rare example of a good war.
Yeah,
in the same way as World War II was, and it's very clear who the aggressor is. We can argue perhaps about the nuances. Personally, I don't think there are that many nuances, but I'm sure some people do. But yeah.
Well, one nuance, and sorry, Antonio, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask Richard's point about writing history on the fly. I mean, can you write history on the fly? It seems to me to be quite soon to write a history.
Yeah,
we defining your terms. I don't quite know how you do it.
Yeah. I think that there's a sort of there's no rules here, but almost an unwritten rule that you have to sort of wait a generation or at least sort of 15 years after events. Things have to settle down, and as you say, the event has to finish surely before you start writing about it. So yeah, there is that. So this is absolutely the first draft. The thing is, he writes with such sort of authority, and he absolutely knows his subject. He knows Ukrainian history brilliantly well. He is, as I said, he's the authority on Ukrainian history. It doesn't feel like it's that sort of journalistic first draft. It doesn't give that impression, to its credit. So
I suppose in one sense it's such the reasons behind the war are so long-standing and are historical. So it is a modern war, but it's very rooted in the history. So I suppose in that sense, you need a historian's eye, not just a journalist's eye, right? Yeah,
indeed, and a lot of the sort of longer term strategic stuff that he teases out in his conclusions, about that this is potentially looking at the eclipsing of Russia long term. That we were in a multipolar world and we're going to go back to a bipolar world And one of those poles is not going to be Moscow, it's going to be Beijing and Washington. Which, from the perspective of right now, looks absolutely right, and I think that's a fair shout on his part. So a lot of that stuff, the sort of wider strategic stuff that he's raising is really interesting, and again, it feels authoritative as well. It doesn't feel like it's a sort of a journalistic punt.
But English isn't his first language. This has been translated, or
No, he's written it himself.
Oh, right, okay.
But
I'd hope he's written it himself.
No, he didn't need a translation later. But he is, when he speaks, it's very fluent English. So I mean, he's a professor of history at Harvard University. But what you mentioned a nuance, and I wanted to mention this because Owen Matthews, because everyone asked the question, how's this war going to end? And we're not going to linger too much longer on Ukraine, but how's this war going to end? And a lot of people think about suggesting perhaps Russia keeps the Donbass and Crimea because militarily it's very difficult to regain those territories. But Plochy is very unequivocal on that, whereas Owen Matthews, I think, is a bit more pragmatic on that standpoint, and that's a bit of a difference between the two. Obviously, Plochy's Ukrainian and says they will fight to the end.
Matthews as well, to be fair to him, I think he's spent a lot of time in Moscow.
He said to me that would any country in the West be willing to sever a part of their own country?
Yeah. I mean, it's, one thing worth mentioning there is Owen Matthews, obviously, well, I'm imagining he's British. I think he's British, isn't he? But he spent a long time in Moscow as a foreign correspondent, so to some extent, he's not necessarily sort of Russophilic in that sense, but he's probably more attuned to Russian sensibilities. So maybe that explains to some extent why he thinks that would be a suitable solution. Personally, I wouldn't say that. You ask any country in Europe which 20% of their territory they're willing to give up to an aggressive neighbour, and most of them would say none. And I think that's the right response. So I mean, it might come to pass that this is a necessary concession to make at some point, but at the moment, while the winds are in Ukraine's favour, as they seem to be, fingers crossed at the moment, then why should they be thinking about territorial concessions at all?
I just want to just briefly pick up on something which is Owen Matthews also writes brilliant historical fiction. Just if anybody's
is it spy fiction?
Yeah, so kind of. It's a trilogy that he's written set in 50s and 60s. Soviet Russia, and the hero is a KGB officer called Vasin, and in the first one it's all around nuclear, Russia's big nuclear experiments, and the most recent one starts in the Gulag, and I won't ruin it for you because they follow on from each other, so there's too many spoilers, but if anybody is interested in kind of Soviet thrillers, Owen Matthews is the guy. They're really, really good. I love them.
KGB hero.
I mean, obviously he's a bit tortured because
he's literally and metaphorically.
Yeah, he's tortured rather than torturer in this case, which is like ideal in your hero. But they're very worth read. I highly recommend.
Can we mention that you're writing a book at the moment?
Yeah, I mean. Can we? Yes, I think so.
I mean, I want you to. But do you mind?
No, go on. No. So although I'm still reviewing historical fiction, I've now moved professionally towards history. So I'm writing a book now about Stalin and the Cambridge Five. So I'm quite into this period of history. But the KGB stuff from Owen is, I think, really well done.
Fantastic. And Richard, do you have a book that you want to talk about?
Well, there's not just one book of the year, I suspect, for all of us. I mean, the book that kind of garnered a lot of press and will be a talking point of a history book of the year will be Nigel Biggar's Colonialism. And part of the story is that, I mean, in a sense, there are some people perhaps in a publisher which will remain unnamed, in brackets Bloomsbury, that potentially cancelled this book quicker than a Philip Schofield tribute telethon. The book came out and it was basically great that it did. And it also sold in bucket loads, of course. I read the book looking for some controversy, but, it was far more consistent than a Prince Harry witness statement. He'd done his research. It's plenty of evidence, and I'm not the only one that kind of enjoyed the book. But in terms of a history book, there wasn't a lot of hoo-ha about it. Whether it was deserved or not, I'll open up to you.
I mean, I read it. I could see why it was controversial because, in the current environment, anything that doesn't take a sort of a very black and white view about colonial history is going to come in for flack. I thought the flack itself was absurdly ridiculous. We've got to be able to have conversations openly about everything. Otherwise, who are we? The book was good. I really enjoyed it. I probably don't know enough context to judge his argument, but the idea that we can stifle people writing about the past because of our own preoccupations with the present seems to me to be so dangerous and so wrong-headed that I sort of read it on principle. So
yeah, I agree with that. I think it's like one of those sort of bellwether books in a way that it were that written 20 years ago, it wouldn't even have caused a flurry at all. It wouldn't have caused any interest or wouldn't have been considered remarkable. And yet where we are in this sort of curious world of the culture wars and so on, it's suddenly seen as a sort of a heinous act of heresy. It's nothing of the sort, of course, as we know. It's a very measured and moderate and thoughtful book. So as much as anything, it just reflects on what strange times we're living in.
Even if it wasn't a measured and thoughtful book, and as I say, I don't feel necessarily massively qualified to judge that. The idea that you should be able to publish a non-measured, a non-thoughtful, a polemical book about anything you want. Yeah. Otherwise, we have nothing. We're just a collection of kind of rules laid down by people who have no authority and no kind of mandate. It's just extraordinary that we're in this situation.
Yeah, I agree.
So in one sense, the book itself doesn't really matter. What matters is the fact that it should be free to read. If it's well written enough, which it was, if it's authoritative enough, which it was, and if it was argued well enough, which it was, qualitatively it's good enough to be published. Therefore, anybody who thinks it shouldn't have been should really get out of the industry and go and do something like, I don't know, involving safe spaces and umbrellas or something. I don't know.
It's bizarre. He's a friend of the show. He's been on. Listeners will be familiar with Nigel Biggar, and I found like all three of you, I was expecting controversy and didn't really find it. I wouldn't say I agree with every single thing in the book, but that's true of many history books.
Yeah.
Yes, and one criticism that he receives, which is just ridiculous, is that he's not a scholar of empire, whatever that means, because it's not as if Nigel Biggar is professor of fun at Clown University. Mm-hmm. He's been a very distinguished professor at Oxford for many years. So some of the criticism he takes is just so bizarre.
Yeah. But I suppose that one of the things about that is history is one of those rare disciplines that anybody can set themselves up as a historian. And if you are an academic historian, who wants to sort of jealously guard your citadel, it must be quite annoying that people come in and set themselves up and often make more money than you. So
and sometimes have more original ideas than you, let's be honest.
Or aren't bound by the strictures of academia, which do make it very difficult to be creative in your non-fiction world, right? Yeah. Because if you have to produce certain documents and jump through certain hoops to get funding or whatever, you can't go off and write something wildly popular. It doesn't work like that. So I think that's probably.
I mean, a lot of the criticism that Nigel received was from that kind of wonderful oxymoron of the cultural historians, where it's not necessarily a subject they may have studied the noble pursuit of English literature, which is fine, and cultural studies are fine, but then to sort of dress yourself up in the weeds of historian doesn't necessarily convince all the people all the time.
No.
Not
so
me.
we've done Ukraine, we've done colonialism. What should we do next? Should we go to some historical fiction, I think?
Okay. So do you know what? It hasn't actually been a very stellar year for historical fiction. I think one of the reasons being there are too many feminist retellings of Greek myths. Every other book I get on my desk is a feminist retelling of a Greek myth. And I'm a feminist. I love a Greek myth, right? But after the 15th, I'm kind of done. But there have been some really good ones. So the kind of literary fiction one that I really loved this year was called For Thy Great Pain, Have Mercy on My Little Pain by Victoria Mackenzie, which is quite an extraordinary title. It's laying claim to something if you call your book something like that. Anyway, so it's about Julian of Norwich. Do you chaps know about Julian of Norwich?
Was he a chronicler?
She.
I knew it was a she.
Yeah.
Not John Julius Norwich. Then.
No, not John Julius Norwich. No. So Julian of Norwich was lived in the 13th century,
Saint?
and she was was she sainted? Maybe. Anyway, so she was an anchoress, but she lived alone in a room for years and years and years, and was incredibly wise, and can lay claim to be one of the first female writers of English. And anyway,
sounds like a historian.
Yeah, lived alone in her room miserably.
Very wise.
She's wise in a room full of moss and misery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Only recognised decades, centuries after her existence.
But that sounds really original and interesting.
It's really original. So Victoria Mackenzie, it's a debut, it's brilliantly done. It intersperses the story of Julian with the story of Marjorie Kemp, who was also a prophetess at the time, and the bits with Marjorie Kemp are actually really funny because she goes around kind of prophesying and everybody finds her quite annoying and they run away from her and she chases after them, telling them about Jesus, which is all great fun. But it's a very brilliantly written book of two strong voices, it's quite profound, and there's a lot to think about. And I'm really impressed. As a debut, it was extraordinary. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what she does next. And also it's very short. So.
Oh, well, I like that. I like short books.
Yeah.
I don't mind a long title.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very long title and a quite short book.
I should mention to listeners that all the links to these books will be in the show notes. And if you want to dig more into Nigel Biggar, there's an interview that we did with him earlier on in the year.
On that, can I just, as an aside, you said that's her debut, and it's very impressive. And presumably we don't know how long that took her to put together. But then, how often do those debuts, are the follow-ups as good? Is that something that almost becomes a curse for an author that they?
Yeah, the second book is always a really difficult one. I think especially when you've had so much success with your first one.
Yeah.
And some people literally have only one really great book, that's it. And they, like for example, so there was all that fuss, wasn't there, when Harper Lee brought out the sequel to Kill a Mockingbird, and everybody was like, "Oh my god, it's
40 years later as well."
Yeah, it's 40 years later, and Atticus turned out to be a dreadful racist. Was quite upset by that.
That's a spoiler. I haven't read it.
I think Atticus Fish did an endorsement for colonialism.
Yeah, Atticus Fish loves Nigel Biggar. You heard it here. So. Yeah, I think it's a difficult thing.
Yeah.
Often the second book, if you've had a success first book, you are chivied along to deliver and make some more money. So there is that thing where, as you say, as a writer has taken X amount of years to craft that first book, and the second book is like, can you do it in half the time? Which some people are actually fine with, but others is more difficult.
I remember not long ago, a couple of months ago, I was stuck in an airport departure lounge, and I spotted Anthony Beeville. We'd just been at the same history festival. This is in Copenhagen.
You can afford to be in the same airport lounge as Anthony Beeville.
Absolutely right. You heard it here.
The conference must have been paying people.
So we were chatting for about an hour or so, and I've spoken to Anthony before, but he was talking about. He mentioned this about the pressure of after Stalingrad, which wasn't his first book, to be fair, but it was his first really big.
Huge.
And it was a huge hit. I mean, we're talking, 1.8 million in the UK or something ridiculous, which is insane for a history book. And he said that the pressure of following that up, from the publisher, from the press, from his agent, from everybody, and from himself, was almost crippling. Unless someone who's already an established historian who had written by that time probably 3 or 4 books.
I was working in a bookshop when Berlin came out, and he kindly came in and did a signing, funnily enough. when James Holland was still doing publicity. This is how many years ago?
Against it.
And it was an event. I mean, this was, selling gazillions of
Yeah, it
copies.
was, yeah.
And they're sort of few and far between the history market
Yeah.
for having such an event. I do think there's less pressure on historians to deliver so quickly. But for instance, I think, what was it? Georgina, Duchess of Devonshire, the sort of follow-up by, my namesake, Foreman, Amanda Foreman. And the follow-up, which was a separate subject, maybe took 15 years, I'm not so sure. And I think that's partly due to some pressure, I guess. I don't know.
Maybe one of us will be successful enough to understand this pressure.
Yes, that'd be
at
nice.
some point.
Then we can come back and discuss it. Can't we?
Yeah.
From your first book, it sounds like what you need is Putin to invade Poland, and then all
Yes.
your books will fly off the shelf.
Yeah, in an exact sort of replica of 17th of September 1939.
Yeah.
Obviously, so that the whole comparison need not be made to.
Well, listeners, Roger has just slipped me both a note and £20 to say, well, tell us about your new book, The Forgers, that's out on August the 10th, I believe.
Very
Can
unsubtle.
you give us
Very unsubtle.
and that's with inflation, £20, unfortunately.
It is. It's out on 10th of August, Bodley Head in the UK. The Forgers. It's the fascinating and hitherto unknown story of a group of Polish diplomats and Jewish activists working out of Bern in Switzerland, who during the war were forging in a very sort of systematic sort of cottage industry style, were forging Latin American passports, mainly Paraguayan, which they then spirited into occupied Poland in an effort to save Polish Jews, primarily Polish Jews, from the Holocaust. It's quite a remarkable story, and it's one of those that kind of slipped through the cracks, like so many. So many of the stories that I tend to pick up on, because I do like those stories that have disappeared. Retreading, another book about the Dam Busters is my idea of Hades, frankly. But there we are.
You always mention the Dam Busters.
I do. It's my little thing. I mean, it's a great story. I love the Dam Busters.
Another book has come out about the
I
Dam
know.
Busters.
They come out
Another
all
dam
the
has just
time.
been busted.
Yes.
But that's my kind of go-to as an example of retread history. I can't really be bothered with it. But anyway, so this is this wasn't really known about until literally wasn't known about until 5 years ago, and then it was discovered by the then Polish ambassador in Bern in Switzerland, who was given the sort of the tip off that his residence was a scene of great historical events, and he got one of his staff to start researching this, and then I was brought in at some point, shown the material that they'd got, and said, "This is a good story. Do you fancy it?" And I said, "Absolutely." And it's a fabulous story. They reckon we know that they distributed around 10,000 or passports to 10,000 people, which gives you the scale of the thing. And of those, we know that upwards of 800 actually survived the Holocaust, which is remarkable.
And not that 10,000 survived then.
No,
So if you
10,000
were issued a
received
passport,
passports.
The
The problem is that what the Germans used to do was that they would take those that proclaimed themselves to be Paraguayans, because what the passport system did was it basically sort of put a sort of legal stick in the wheel of the Holocaust mechanism, right? Because part of the Holocaust mechanism, which is something that people don't really appreciate, is that it required a delegalization of the victims, right? So they had to have no rights, right? Because Nazi Germany, although we imagine that it's kind of this sort of this chaotic race-based dictatorship where anything can happen, it's actually still a state governed by law. It's still a Rechtsstaat in that sense. They've perverted the law, but the law still functions. So you can't just take people away and murder them in Auschwitz. So you have to delegalize them first. So the act of deportation, for example, for German Jews, the act of deportation when they actually leave the country, that was the point at which their citizenship effectively lapsed, right? And the same thing with Polish Jews. So Polish Jews were in a position where their Polish identity, legal identity, had already been abolished with the abolition of Poland after the invasion, And then they were given these sort of temporary documents which didn't have any sort of legal weight at all. So effectively, the Germans could do with them what they wanted. So what it meant that they could, when they could brandish one of these Paraguayan passports, for example, it meant that it created a legal framework again, albeit theoretical. So the German authorities basically kind of throw their arms up and go, oh blimey, look, there's another one, and we send them rather than Auschwitz, we send them to Belsen. And to the British mind, Belsen is a pretty terrible place, and it was. But that was a sort of hybrid camp where they kept all sorts of kind of liminal categories of Jews and prisoners of all sorts. And they sent these, what they called exchange Jews, to Belsen, in the expectation that at some point they could exchange these Jews for German citizens abroad. The problem is, of course, that if that was 1943 and you get sent to Belsen, you've got to survive 2 years in Belsen, which is no easy thing, because Belsen is increasingly, as the war goes on, and particularly by end of 44, 45, it's an absolute hellhole. Rampant disease, and the conditions are horrific and so on. So you've got to survive potentially 2 years in Belsen, and that's the bit that a lot of them don't survive. What
was the difference between Belsen and Auschwitz?
Belsen is a sort of regular concentration camp in that sense, and it's a hybrid camp in that it has parts of it that are classified as a concentration camp and other parts that are classified as an internment camp. So the exchange Jews are sent to a camp within it, which is an internment camp. So they don't have to work, at least until later on in the war. They can keep their own clothes, for example. They can keep luggage. So they're not kept like concentration camp prisoners. So they're kept as privileged prisoners because they're expected. They want them to survive so they can be exchanged. Auschwitz is also a hybrid. I mean, it has the concentration camp aspect to it, but of course Auschwitz-Birkenau, has the death camp element to it as well. So shorthand, when we say someone was sent to Auschwitz, it means we're sending them you're sending them to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and they're being gassed and exterminated. So they're very different animals, actually. I mean, the end result, if you're in them, is kind of very often not dissimilar, but actually they're very different animals. And this is one of the curiosities. I know this is a niche thing and kind of reflects my kind of weird interest in Nazi Germany, but all of the concentration camps are kind of unique in their own way. They all have their own, peculiar, weird, horrible character. But
is that a reflection of the region and or staff?
It's as much a reflection of that as the fact that there were no sort of cookie cutter instructions of this is how it's supposed to be. Theoretically, they had that, and the camp was originally supposed to be. Sachsenhausen was one of those.
I went there.
Yeah.
You can see the roofs of normal local residents just over the walls.
And the same with Dachau. I mean, Dachau was set up in 1933. Is the first one of the Nazi concentration camps, but. Sachsenhausen was one of the first of the second wave in 1936 that were set up, and it was meant to be a sort of a model concentration camp. This is how we're going to do it. This is how it's going to look, and this is how it's going to function. So they did have, to some extent, that sort of cookie cutter, but then it didn't really work because it's always been the conditions already been modified by the local situation, or as you say, the staff or whoever the commandant is or whatever it is. And then, of course, the death camps are a different category altogether, and a lot of those are hybrids. So, like Auschwitz-Birkenau, it's a concentration camp and it's also a death camp. So then you kind of lose any sort of idea of clarity about what you're dealing with. So to put it, the short answer is Auschwitz-Birkenau versus Belsen. They are both absolutely abhorrent places. But of the two, you'd probably want to be in Belsen. So that was, for these prisoners, certainly, this was considered the better place to be. At least they had the chance to survive. The tragedy is that not many of them did. So of those 10,000 that we know that over 800 did survive, which is remarkable. And it's not far off, Oskar Schindler figures. That's about 1,100 that he enabled to survive. So it's quite possible that others will, with the book, that others will come forward because this was an unknown story. It's not
When's the book out, Roger?
It's out on August the 10th.
I'm not sharing my £20 for that.
Well, I'm just going to have a bit of cheese with some fig jam that was sent in by a listener. So, Deborah Steen, thank you very much. Right, moving on. to probably something more cheerier. Have we got a book that's a bit cheerier?
Well, I've got a fun book that's due out in July. I've just been sent the proof, and for all of the sex and violence, or because of the sex and violence, it's fun. So Tom Holland is bringing out a new book about the Roman Empire called Pax, and it's due out the beginning of July, and he's basically hit it out the park again. I mean, the book is excellent. He's just brilliant. I mean,
How does he have the time?
Clever, Roger. It's clever. I believe he's on tour at the moment in America, funny enough.
And listeners,
with
he
his-
will be a guest on the podcast in July.
Excellent. Well, I mean, he's brilliant at picking out what's kind of relevant with the Roman Empire and its personalities. But he's also unafraid of just, the Roman Empire was weird and different. And he's just excellent at just kind of insight, humour, colour. I mean, loads of people have written books about this period before, but his one will be a bit like Rubicon, sort of the one to go to. He kind of, it straddles scholarship, but entertaining as well. So that is, comfortably a kind of history book of the year.
Well, I read. Sorry to interrupt you there, Roger. I read his introduction, and I'm going to be taking it away with me to Greece on Saturday. And his introduction was I thought beautifully written argument for how we shouldn't judge the past by the present, but very subtly written in that way. And I think that's something that I don't want to mention any names, but some historians forget.
Mm.
Can we please mention the names on an additional podcast?
We can. Patreon members get all the true gossip.
It'll be a long list.
No, I'm on Tom Holland. I'm a big fan of Tom Holland. So I think the podcast that they do, The Rest is History, not obviously a rival podcast, but it is brilliant. You have to say it's brilliant.
It is brilliant.
And he's a proper intellect, and he writes beautifully. And I remember very clearly my first exposure to Tom, as it were, was doing the Dartington Festival way back. This is when I was publicising Killing Hitler, so that sort of dates it. It was 2006.
You're a teenager.
I was a teenager, yeah. And I was on the bill after Tom Holland, and Tom Holland, I think, was talking about Rubicon.
It would have been that long
I
ago.
think that's how long ago it was. And I sat in the audience and listened to Tom talking about Rubicon, and I knew I was on next on the same stage, and I just sat there and I just went, oh my god, how do I follow this guy? And he was fantastic. He was absolute box office, and he still is. In my book.
And the rest of his history is fantastic. He's just his I think a 4-parter where we're speaking. We've just had part 3 of the Irish Revolution. It's just wonderful. Yeah,
it is amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm so there are very few sort of historians writing that when they've got a new book coming out, I will literally clear the decks to read it, and that's one I can't wait. Very looking forward to it. I'm very jealous of you.
I shall sell you my proof. But in terms of there is an elephant in the room where one of the board members is missing today, Saul David. And in terms of a book of the year, his paperback is recently out, Devil Dogs. And I did one of these kind of podcasts before. I mean, technically it was a book of last year, but the paperback is out now. Mm-hmm. And it's just an excellent piece of military history. He's just, a veteran at doing these things. And the book has plenty of kind of, heroism and tragedy. It's also got one of the best postscripts of a book I've ever read, where he basically talks about certain soldiers in the Pacific Campaign, but then he traces what happened afterwards. Bless him, he done some research. Well done, Saul. and it's absolutely powerhouse stuff. And it's he's very comfortable in the Second World War. Yeah. But this is one of his best books. So in terms of a sort of, rather than take an unwieldy hardback, if you just want to take a paperback abroad, Devil Dogs, I'll give an 8 out of 20. No joking. 10 out of 10. Yes.
You'll tear through it. It's great. Reading.
Yeah.
No, he's absolutely. He's in a purple patch at the moment, still, isn't he? So he's doing some lovely stuff.
Yeah.
So one novel I want to mention, and Antonia, I noticed the Fig Jam is very popular.
I know, so I'm smearing it all
everywhere.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah.
We're in a very sticky situation at the moment.
Oh dear. But one novel that the listeners will be familiar with from earlier on in the year, which was Jamie McGillivray. Jamie McGillivray by John Sayles, and it's a rip-roaring tale set during the 7 Years' War, and it is. I absolutely loved it. It was just one of those novels. It was very epic. Don't worry, you can make as much noise as you like when opening this bottle, listeners. And I know, Antonia, you loved it as well because
love it.
it made the fiction book of the month for historical fiction in the Times.
Yeah, no, it was excellent. Really
The London
good.
Times for international readers, that is.
Yeah.
Listeners.
Really kind of old-fashioned, I thought. So, kind of, Rick Roaring, Walter Scott kind of adventure story, spanning kind of years, and I thought it was great. It was really good. Yeah, and you loved it. I know you loved it.
Yeah.
Why did you love it so much?
I don't know. I just think
His ancestors were probably in it.
Yeah.
we'd have been the bad guys in that. But I don't know why. I think it was because it reminded me of Fenimore Cooper, Last of the Mohicans type stuff. And that's right on my street, It's just the epic nature of the American wilderness and the forests, the mighty fir trees and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it starts off at Culloden, which is this is a battle. I think was the last battle on British soil, and was the destruction of Highland culture, I believe. And they're all thinking. Listeners,
1746.
I'm pretty sure that is the last battle.
I mean,
on
there's
British
the culture wars
soil.
going on at the moment.
That's a war.
But listeners, do write in to disprove Ollie wrong. Should he be?
I did set this as a question for the Christmas quiz, and it was, and someone came back to me and said, "Well, what about the Falklands War?" And that's a bit of an interesting one because technically it's not really British
It's a
soil.
protectorate. Is that?
Yeah, it's a little bit more than is it what is it technically?
Good one.
It was a good challenge.
Yeah.
But
it depends
it's good,
on
but
the
it's
legal
not right.
status of Falklands, isn't
Yeah.
it? But we're not France, let's be honest. I mean, in so many ways, but we're not France. So our colonies are not automatically French soil. So.
Yeah.
Good point, Roger.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I'm going to mention just one more book that I have just started, which is David Carpenter's second volume of his biography of Henry III. And I mean, for kind of, medievalists and historians and academics, I mean, this is a kind of an event book where the first book was incredibly well received, but the second book has kind of got the sexy stuff coming of Simon de Montfort and introducing Edward I. And I mean, I've just started it, but it's excellent. I mean, he is an academic that can completely write with complete kind of command of his subject that we can only kind of envy and admire. So in terms of people interested in, in the sense the 13th century and those personalities, it's an absolute must because, I mean, this 2-volume biography, that's it. It's the first and last word, really. And I would highly recommend that as well. I know that Sebag Montefiore and Dan Jones have recommended it, and they know a thing or two about putting a kind of history book together, and they've praised it to the hill. So that's another one that has just come out that I would highly recommend.
Okay, that sounds good.
I would, just on the subject of academics who can write, which is a relatively small subset of academics. But no, I mean, I joke, but no, I don't. But on that subject, my old lecturer, Martin Rady, who's now retired from CEAS, but he was the Masaryk Professor of Central European History at the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies, University of London. He was a great mate. We used to, back in the day, it felt like he wasn't that much older than I was when I was an undergraduate, and we did used to go drinking. We used to have sort of 4 to 5 o'clock seminars, and then afterwards we'd go to the Institute of Education for a few beers. So it was all very jolly back in the day, and he was great fun. I mean, tremendously knowledgeable. and he's just published a history of Central Europe, a new history of Central Europe, which is called The Middle Kingdoms, which is coming out with Alan Lane, I think. Coming out this summer. It is a reasonably weighty tome, it must be said. It's a big book, but it has a wonderful lightness of being, I have to say, to it. He's one of those people, he has endless knowledge about Central Europe, and more so than probably anyone else writing on the subject at the moment. But he
Including
has...
you.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I'm very happy to make that concession, I mean, interestingly, his background is Hungarian Habsburg history, Hungarian history, and his sort of fetish, if you like, his historical fetish was Hungarian legal history. So that's where he was a real
niche.
specialist.
Yeah.
Absolutely, very niche. But in the process of teaching Central European history to generation upon generation of undergrads and postgrads like myself back in the day in the early 90s, he knows it backwards. And the main thing where I came into this was that he can write. And he said himself, I was at the launch last week, he said himself when he was launching the book, that this was his retirement project, it was his lockdown project, and it was him kind of freed of the shackles of academia. So he's writing in a way, and it was quite sweet really, because he said, well, I was free and I could write each chapter I could introduce with a sort of set piece of an individual, and that could be instructive of the whole. And I thought, well, hang on, this is what the rest of us outside academia do all the time. But for him, as an academic, this was kind of novel.
Was he freed up from the idea of the point system almost? And
I think so. Yeah,
I'm not writing for my institution.
Yeah, exactly. He's writing for a public.
So bring out the style.
And he absolutely can do it. It's full of wry asides, and I mean, you laugh every page. Because and for me, especially when you know the guy, you can hear his voice, and sometimes you know where he's having a go, and it's hilarious. So there's lots of humour in it as well, because there's endless humour in sort of Central European history, because some of it is so bizarre. Yeah. But he covers it so well, and his brilliance where he's sort of teasing out those areas of congruence with the sort of Western European norms, historical norms and historical trends and so on, and then he pulls out where the Central European experience is radically different, So it's a really, really good read. It buzzes along, As I said, it's a hefty book, so it's an ask for the beach, but it's well worth it. It's well worth it.
Now, in terms
just before you do, Richard, that actually Martin wrote a piece for us in our most recent magazine. So if that tickles your fancy, he wrote an interesting piece on Matyas Rákosi, the Soviet sort of Stalinist ruler of Hungary. Yeah, which was very interesting. Really interesting. I think. My pronunciation. Sorry, my Hungarian's not as strong as it could be. Sorry, Roger.
No worries.
Dear oh dear.
Yeah.
Richard, I interrupted you.
But do you have one fiction book you'd like to mention?
Well, I do, because you've just seen me stand up and grab it. Well, I've been sent... I have a bit of a... from childhood, I loved a bit of Wilbur Smith. And so Wilbur Smith is no longer with us, sadly, but he has got a new series out taking his Courtneys back in time. And it's Stormtide and Nemesis, I think. So if you want to, nice, relaxed, sit on the beach, don't worry about life, and want to read a good bit of historical fiction, I think the new Courtney series written by Wilbur Smith, the latest of which is Nemesis.
Can I suggest a historical adventure book by someone who's alive?
Yes. Yes. The listeners must be confused. How the hell did he write the book when he was not alive?
Ooh.
Yeah.
No.
He was, so I mean, I'm sure it's wonderful. It's ghostwritten by an excellent writer, and so I'm sure it's wonderful. But there is his new star of historical adventure that I just want everybody to know about, who irritatingly is only in her 20s, which I find actually personally offensive. But anyway, skating over that. So her name is Katie, I think it's Day-sh, I don't really know how to pronounce it, Day-sh, D-A-Y-S-H.
Isn't that the name of ISIS?
Yeah. Daesh.
No, that's Daesh.
Oh right, sorry.
No, she's very much not in
She's
ISIS.
not ISIS.
Okay.
Unless ISIS have taken to writing Age of Sail historical fiction.
Yes.
So
I've heard of this
That's
book.
not gonna
my
float.
goodness. That's not
Oh
gonna
dear. I've heard of this book.
Okay, first of all, you have to understand that I love historical fiction. The historical fiction I love best is anything involving a sail. I'm completely obsessed with it. I've read everything more than once.
Hornblower.
I literally...
John Sayles.
Yeah. I went John Sayles. I literally went sailing on tall ships when I was in my 20s because I'd read too much Hornblower, so I wanted to go and climb the rigging, which I then did and discovered it was actually quite scary. Anyway, so that's the background. So I really know what I'm talking about. And Casey has written a book called Leeward. It's out with a very with a kind of small but pugnacious and very ambitious press called Canelo. And it's completely fantastic. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It starts with the Battle of the Nile. There's a brilliant set piece opening where the hero of her new intended trilogy of novels is called Captain Nightingale, and he is caught in the explosion of the French flagship. And anyway, he then sort of goes on to the Caribbean. The kind of, I guess, the quirky selling point of this book is that it's also a gay love story. So it's the first kind of, I guess, queer Age of Sail novel. But any of you who might think that's off-putting, really grow up. It's brilliant. And the love story is beautifully done. It feels like a cross between C.S. Forrester and Mary Renault. And if you've read both of those authors, you know what I'm talking about. You need to go and read this book. It's brilliant. So there we go. That's my pitch.
Well, it seems that that's your book of the year, almost, if you had to nail your colours to the mast.
Oh, I see that. Nailing my colours to the mast, I would say that is the book that I would climb the rigging for this year.
I mean, I would say, for me, it's Tom Holland's Pax, which I know is not quite out yet, but listeners, it's due. And Roger, what if you had to say one book of the year in not the Forgers? What would it be?
I'm going. This might surprise you. I'm going to go with Katja Hoyer's Beyond the Wall, which there are issues to raise, which we can maybe talk about, but I think is a brilliant book. She writes like a dream. I mean, it's full of anecdotes and vignettes and she makes a very good case that she is, redeeming a history that's kind of been forgotten and a little bit willfully forgotten, the history of the GDR. GDR was, as she says in her introduction, it was there for 40 years. This is longer than the First World War, the Second World War, Nazi Germany all combined, and yet it's kind of dismissed as a sort of anomaly, as something that of lesser interest, as a sort of diversion from the norm, and she does a decent job. I'm kind of, the word in my head is rehabilitating it, which is not right because I don't want to be rehabilitating communism, but she rehabilitates the history of that state and of its whatever it was,
with humour as well,
and with humour and with feeling, and it's a really, really interesting book. Beautiful, I have to say, beautifully written. Absolutely beautifully written. And she doesn't skate over the bad stuff at all. She goes into all of the Stasi stuff. The book starts, the opening section of the book is the German communists in the 1930s in the Soviet Gulag, right? So there's no whitewashing communism in that sense. My sort of slight concern with it is that there is a sort of constituency out there of people who, look at that book and say, see, communism wasn't that bad, which is kind of that's not her intention. She's not trying to rehabilitate communism. She's trying to rehabilitate the state that she grew up in.
The Cambridge 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th and 10th.
We absolutely can't be in the business of holding people responsible for the reactions of arseholes to their books, right?
Yeah.
It happens all the time.
Yeah.
You get a pretty decent book and it's hijacked by a kind of interest group to prove their point. But it's not the fault of the person who wrote the book.
I agree. And that's what I came around. So I say there were sort of things about it in a way that sort of bothered me. But then rereading some of it last night, I just thought this is actually a really bloody good book. It's very well written. It beautifully illustrates, the period that she's trying to bring to life, and I think for me that would be my book of the year.
I mean, I would say, listeners, there is no book that doesn't bother Roger in some way. But it to be 8/10 brilliant is basically a masterwork.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just going to mention probably a couple of others, but very quickly. And I've just come back from a very enjoyable cycling trip around World War I, France and Belgium. And The Path of Peace by Anthony Seldon. It's very lovely reading, really. It takes you away. It's a tragic... The World War One, the cemeteries, and cycling through France, there's just endless numbers of cemeteries you cycle past. Makes you realise the sacrifice. But his book's very enjoyable, so I'd recommend that. And then very briefly, Palatine by Peter Stothard, which deals with the same period that I think Tom Holland's reading just a little bit before, but it's lots of fun. It's completely outrageous and vulgar, just like those Romans. And listeners will know I prefer the Greeks, but in this case, it's hilarious.
So if you had to choose one book, Mine Host, which would it be?
I would go for the Serhii Plocki book.
We've ended as we've begun.
We have.
Lovely segueing, host.
Thank you, Richard, for doing my job for me. That's awesome. So listeners, links, as I said, links you'll find in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening, and please rate and review if you can. And if my guests enjoyed this, perhaps they'll return at Christmas and we'll do it again.
Yeah.
Thank you.